CEO humiliated the single dad, then saw herself as a little girl in his old photo. The entire executive floor went silent when the CEO pointed at the single father standing beside the conference room door and told him he did not belong there. She had no idea that the old photograph sticking out of his worn wallet was about to expose a part of her childhood she had spent 20 years trying to forget. And she certainly did not know that the man she was humiliating had once been the only stranger who had stopped to help a frightened little girl on a summer afternoon when nobody else cared. Before we begin, if you believe kindness deserves a second chance and that one small act can change a person's entire life, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this story, leave a comment, and subscribe to Real Dad Story. Your support helps us bring more emotional stories like this to you. It was a bright Tuesday morning at the headquarters of Veyron Crest Industries, where sunlight poured through the enormous glass windows and reflected across polished floors. Employees hurried through the lobby wearing expensive suits, carrying tablets and coffee, while executives moved with the confidence of people who had never worried about their next meal. Among them stood a man who looked completely out of place. His name was Mateo Raines, a 38-year-old single father who worked in the company's facilities department. He wore a neatly pressed but faded blue uniform, inexpensive black shoes, and a simple silver watch that had belonged to his late father. Mateo had learned to live without luxury. His greatest pride was his 8-year-old son, Jonah, who was waiting at school that afternoon for Mateo to pick him up. Mateo had been called upstairs because a serious problem had appeared in the company's archive system. A collection of old contracts had been damaged after a storage room leak, and Mateo had discovered that several boxes contained documents the legal department desperately needed. He had spent most of the previous night carefully drying papers, organizing folders, and photographing damaged pages. His supervisor had told him to deliver the recovered files directly to the CEO's assistant. Mateo had never expected to meet the CEO herself. Her name was Seraphina Vale, a 42-year-old woman known throughout the business world for turning a struggling company into a billion-dollar empire. She was brilliant, disciplined, and almost impossible to impress. Her childhood had been difficult, but nobody in the company knew much about it. Seraphina rarely spoke about her parents, her early years, or the mysterious summer when she was 8 years old and disappeared from a neighborhood park for several hours. Over the years, she had convinced herself that remembering the past was a weakness. When Mateo entered the executive conference room carrying the recovered documents, Seraphina looked at him from across the table. Her expression immediately hardened. She glanced at his uniform, then at the folder in his hands, and asked why someone from facilities had been brought into an executive meeting. Mateo calmly explained that he had recovered the files and wanted to make sure the documents were safely transferred. But Seraphina was already frustrated because an important investor meeting had been delayed. In front of several senior executives, she accused Mateo of wasting valuable time and told him that people in his position needed to understand boundaries. Mateo lowered his eyes, not because he was ashamed of his work, but because he had learned that arguing with someone who had power rarely changed anything. He quietly apologized and started to leave. Then Seraphina noticed an old photograph partially sticking out of his wallet. It was a small, faded picture with worn corners. She could see a young boy standing beside Mateo, but behind them was something else, a familiar playground, an old red bench, and a little girl wearing a white summer dress. Seraphina froze. She stared at the photograph and suddenly felt as if the room had disappeared. The little girl had dark curls tied with a blue ribbon. Her knees were scraped. Her face was wet with tears. And around her neck hung a tiny silver pendant shaped like a star. Seraphina knew that pendant. She had worn it when she was 8. She asked Mateo where he got the photograph. His expression changed immediately. He looked at the picture, then at Seraphina, confused by the sudden question. He explained that it had been taken many years ago in a small neighborhood park. He had been 17 at the time and had found a frightened little girl sitting beneath a tree after she had wandered away from her family during a crowded community festival. Mateo had stayed with her until her parents arrived. He remembered that she had been crying because she thought nobody was coming back. Seraphina's hands began to tremble. She remembered. Not everything, but enough. She remembered being 8 years old, losing sight of her mother in the crowd, running toward the wrong street, and falling near the playground. She remembered sitting under a tree and believing she had been forgotten. She remembered a teenage boy kneeling several feet away from her, speaking gently and offering her his bottle of water. She remembered him telling her that someone would come. But she had forgotten his face. Until now. Seraphina asked Mateo if the girl in the photograph had been wearing a star-shaped pendant. Mateo looked surprised and said yes. He remembered it because the girl had held it tightly whenever she became frightened. He also remembered her telling him that her father had promised to come back for her. Seraphina could barely breathe. She realized that the stranger she had just humiliated was the person who had once protected her when she was a terrified little girl. But there was another secret. Mateo told her he had kept the photograph because the girl's family had thanked him afterward, and the girl's father had given him the picture as a reminder that kindness mattered. Mateo had never known what became of the little girl. He had simply moved on with his life, eventually becoming a father himself. Seraphina